to kick in here. All right. Hello and welcome to our weekly environmental news program. I'm Dale Willman. I run the Resilience Media Project at Columbia Climate School. This program is being produced in cooperation with the Society of Environmental Journalists. SEJ sends out a daily email roundup of environmental news. I read it every day. It's great. It's free to subscribe and look for it at sej.org. Today we're scheduled to have several guests, but life sometimes gets in the way. So two people had to drop out, but I'm very grateful that we still have with us Ted Nace, and he's a writer and publisher and environmentalist. He's the founder and executive director of Global Energy Monitor. And he was once described as one of the amazing brains and strategists behind the anti-coal movement. And Ted, I think it's wonderful to be called an amazing brain. And I don't know how you live that down. So let me first I'm going to start with Ted. I'm going to talk with Ted in a minute here, but first a reminder, don't forget to stay with us through the whole program. A primary part of what we do here is to discuss how you as a journalist can localize the tools we're going to discuss and how you can use them in your daily coverage. So we're going to have a conversation with that. And if you have a question, put it in the comments on the platform you're using to watch us, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or whatever. And we should be able to see the question here and then respond to them. So if you have a question, please put it in the comments, and we will do our best to respond to those. So Ted, your organization, in a sense, had the data to get this project. We're talking about the registry, but let's talk a little bit about the background of that. First, tell us a little bit about your work and what Global Energy Monitor does, and then how that expanded into the registry.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dale, for giving me the chance to be here and to share about our work. And we ourselves started this project as journalists who wanted to do something to help at that time was the anti-coal movement. There was a lot of coal plants proposed in the United States around 2007, and we got started back then. And what we were all about was a group of people who wanted to create like a research back office that would support all the grassroots groups all around the country and eventually all around the world, working basically to phase out coal-fired power and make a transition to clean power. So one of the things about it is that, typically small environmental groups are up against really well-funded companies who have access to commercial data sets. And, we wanted to give the same basically professional commercial quality data to the environmental movement. And we looked at what industry actually does for themselves. So what industry does, what commercial data companies do is they will survey other companies, ask them what kind of power plants they are building or what kind they own, and this kind of thing. We had a whole different model of research, and it was based on the Wikipedia model, where people all around the world who are involved in the environmental movement actually know a lot about the industry. And by creating we call it a wiki platform, it uses the same technology as Wikipedia. It's called MediaWiki, where there was a way for people all around the world to create online fact sheets about a particular power plant or a pipeline or a coal mine or now about renewables as well. So we now have amassed a collection of 50 or 60,000 of those fact sheets. They're all online. And our goal is to build an open guide to the entire global energy system. So we started with coal plants, and then we extended it to coal mines, eventually to the entire coal sector, including terminals, et cetera. Then we began documenting the rest of the power sector, gas-fired power plants. Now we're documenting renewables. We also began documenting the oil and gas sector, pipelines, gas-fired power plants, et cetera. The part we're going to spend a little bit of extra time talking about today is this, what we call upstream oil and gas, the drilling, the oil fields, the gas fields, the offshore. And we've been working in partnership with other groups who are creating a global resource for oil and gas fields. And so I'll be paying some special attention to that particular project. But I do want to demonstrate our methodology a little bit more and show how journalists can use it, because we are helping journalists both individually. I want to talk about how they can work with our staff individually to get help with a particular thing, who to contact, et cetera, but also just how to use the tools that we've created online. So yeah, I mean, if I could go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, why don't you do that? Quick question while you're doing that. So you mentioned gas lines. You also have transmission lines. Any other elements of energy infrastructure? So it's all energy infrastructure is what you're trying to do?
That's right. So in the power sector, the fossil part of the power sector is coal, gas, oil-fired power plants. Now we also have about 6 different renewable sources: wind, solar, geothermal, bioenergy, nuclear, and what am I forgetting? Geothermal. So that's just to create electricity. So each of those is its own project. Each of those is its own, particular subsector. But those wrapped together are the power. We call it the power sector, the parts that generate electricity. But then over on the other side, the oil and gas side, you've got upstream where they're extracting the oil. Midstream is the pipelines, the LNG tankers, the LNG terminals. And then downstream, of course, all the different ways that oil and gas gets used, particularly from our perspective in power plants.
What elements of this energy infrastructure don't you have at this point, or do you have pretty much everything?
No, we don't. We don't have. What we really lack is a way to track all of the downstream ways that oil and gas gets used. So, for example, we do cover steel plants because they're so large. But we can't cover every gas station, for example. We don't really do a good job around commercial and residential heating because our methodology really focuses on the larger projects. It's also hard for us to cover, solar below a certain threshold because there's literally, millions of solar panels right now, and they're really, really distributed. So yeah, so some things are easier to track than others.
But are there other elements of any categories, electric transmission lines, for instance? Are there other categories of things that you want that you really don't have a good handle on?
Oh, well, I would say increasingly there are some niches that are really interesting. One of them is hydrogen. Another one actually is cryptocurrency. Where actually there are these new call them factories, which are basically stacks of thousands and thousands of computers doing the math that generates Bitcoin, and they are becoming a huge part of energy consumption. Anyway, that's a project that we're piloting right now. It's a cryptocurrency facilities tracker.
Okay, so it sounds like other than that, you've got, at least in these main categories, you've got the infrastructure that you want.
And I apologize, you mentioned power lines. We do not cover power lines.
Okay, so that's excuse me, in a sense, I guess the high power transmission lines would be relatively easy to track, but when you get into everything else, the mains, but the other stuff would be harder because it's, in a sense, like solar, it's distributed. So the big question though is this wiki method. I think most news organizations don't use Wikipedia as a primary news source because anybody can change it, anybody can alter it. How are you okay, or how do you determine the veracity of the data that you're collecting?
Oh, that's right. So our adaptation is that we only let our staff of trained researchers actually modify the platform. So after they create the pages, we will check it with groups around the world. But at this point, we've become so specialized with so many different. There's basically 50 researchers who are on staff now, and we're supported by various philanthropies like Bloomberg Philanthropies, Ford Foundation, et cetera. So we're actually able to have professional researchers do each of these sectors. And those people also become outreach specialists. So, for example, journalists want to know about, say, LNG terminals. There's someone here that is on our website, and I can show how to find people like that to give just to give that kind of individual assistance.
Yeah, and that's a pretty important aspect of that, right? The experts when it comes to journalists, that you have people they can talk to. So these environmental groups upload data to the sites, and then your experts go in before goes live. And
no, it's really the other way around. We create the data, and then we will confirm it with with whoever we can. But basically, once we've created a profile of a coal-fired power plant, it's going to have lots of footnotes, and those are all to public sources. And then that page will get updated every 6 months. So we've been through about 12 rounds of updates for maybe more than that for our global coal plant tracker. That's our oldest tracker, and then our newest trackers are wind and solar. They were just released earlier this year, so they've only been through one update cycle. And as you go through update cycles, things get better. You get you get feedback from the public and from groups around the world.
And so now quick question.
Yeah, some countries are harder to research than others. So there's people who specialize in, there's 6 Chinese researchers, there's 3 Russian researchers, Arabic, etc.
So they spend their time looking for more data that could be included in this.
Yeah, they understand both the commercial and the official sources for those countries. And then, of course, they can read the literature in that language.
And Duncan here is asking if you're tracking fossil fuel contributions to agriculture, which is particularly with factory farming is a pretty big, significant thing.
That's right. We are not.
Okay.
We don't track ethanol either at this point.
Okay, so let's keep going with where you're heading on this. So you were about to bring up your screen and show us some more.
Sure.
And walk us through a little bit of your website, and as you walk through it, talk about how journalists in particular can access this and use this data if you could. So let's get this up here, and there we go. So take it away.
All right.
So this is your splash page, your main page.
That's right. So this is the Global Energy Monitor website, and each of these graphics represents one of the sectors that we track. I'm going to particularly talk about the both oil and gas and coal mining, because these are the ones that we're working with the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels on this particular project. But I want to say that all of these trackers, I'm just going to start with we can consider it our flagship tracker because we've been doing it the longest. So this is the Global Coal Plant Tracker. And just by the way, people can learn. People always say, "Oh, where do you get your funding? Who works there? What is their background?" That's all on our website. You can look up our financials, who's giving us money, who the people are on staff, and then there's lists of who we partner with. So we partner with literally hundreds of groups around data, that we regularly supply data to. Not just journalists, but also a lot of people in academia. People in agencies around the world, and private information companies as well. So, and of course, environmental groups, NGOs, sort of large and small. For a person who wants to sort of get in the mix and get any of this information, what you do is you go to one of these sectors and click on it. So I'm just opening up the Global Coal Plant Tracker. So this is a data set of about 13,000 coal-fired power plants around the world, both existing and proposed. You can open up I'll do it in a minute. You can open up an interactive map and find them that way, or get the general lay of the land, look at a country. So we always believe that in its most useful, we never know if someone wants to look at the big picture or the medium view or really zoom in. So we want to make it very easy to do any of those things, to look at the big picture and then to zoom in and look at one particular plant and down to the footnote, But I want to mention too that there are summary tables available. So all kinds of of sheets that people can download that summarize the information. There's data dashboard, and there's also a feature where anybody can download the data. So we get thousands of requests to download the data, and we track what those are. Keep track of who's getting it and whether they want to keep it regularly updated, et cetera. So, that's all available for people. So I'll just show the download screen. People just have to provide who they are and describe the project, and then they can immediately get the data. It'll be in your email box as an Excel file.
So it's the raw data.
Just the raw data, yeah. But
why would someone want that? How would they use it?
A lot of people in academia do all kinds of energy transition studies. They study air pollution, health effects, climate modeling. There's also groups that use it for campaigning. So, for example, people want to know, okay, give me the top 100 coal companies rank them according to size. Now we're going to run a divestment campaign and target the biggest ones. So there's a group in Germany called Urgewald that does that and updates it as often as we update our data. And they have a rolling campaign where they've talked, various pension funds, or even the Norwegian government's, $1 trillion pension fund. They've talked them into limiting their exposure to coal, both from an environmental standpoint, but also because it's a better investment to get out of some of these sectors that are dying out.
Not if you're Texas government, but perhaps elsewhere.
So just to open up the tracker map here. So this is an interactive map, and you can see.
Is this the coal, or is this combined?
This is for coal-fired power plant.
Okay.
And
so you have an interactive map for each of those segments that you talked about.
For each sector, that's right.
Do you have one that combines them all?
There's one that combines all of the coal ones.
Okay.
And the trick there is you get so many dots, and I'll show you our map with pipelines, and it looks like a big spider web, and you really can't see much detail until you zoom in.
Right.
But just for example, if you click on a single one of these dots, you get, let me zoom in a little bit, because you get these spider webs that you get so many concentrated in one area. But let's take let's just go to India.
Wow.
And let's look at a coal-fired power plant there and see. You can look at what it looks like from a satellite photo. It looks like it's such a small plant that it doesn't stand out. A lot of coal plants are so big. Let's just take another one.
It's a lot of plants in India.
Yeah, there really are. This is so you can see this from the satellite view, this coal plant, and then just by clicking here again, you can go in and see the page that we've created, the fact sheet that we've created on that particular plant, get the background of the plant, see what the plans are, what the health effects are, and then see all the footnotes where we got the information.
This in a sense reminds me of, I can't recall what my head's not in that space right now, but when you're driving on the road and you see a truck with the number designation on it, and you can go in, there's a couple of apps you can go to look them up and see what they're hauling, and it has the same thing, health information, all that sort of layered data that's actually quite interesting and useful.
Yeah, you can also, just if you want to see what one company owns, I'm going to focus in on one of the big coal plant owners called Huadian, which has a ton of companies in China.
And how'd you bring that up?
Oh, up here in the upper right, there's a little filtering box. And so, you want to see, hey, what does Exxon own around the world, or Chevron? You can instantly see all their pipelines.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. So you had that kind of. So I'm sorry, you were back on the company in China.
Yeah. So anyway, I just quickly showed which of the plants in China were owned by that particular company.
Okay.
So anyway, that's sort of the tool is available for all the sectors that we cover. So I guess we cover at this point about 20 sectors, including some regional tools. This one is for Latin America, that's in Spanish and Portuguese rather than in English, and it covers all sectors. Not just coal, or it merges all the sectors into 3 maps: one for renewables, one for oil and gas, and one for coal and steel. I'll just open that up here. And so we've got the 3 maps, we've got the 3 languages, etc. That's actually a new tool that we just released earlier this week. So we also do news and reports, etc. And I want to say that, just the final thing I want to say, because I want to get on and highlight the tools that we're doing in conjunction with the Global Registry. But each of these trackers lists their project manager on the page and the contact information. We're very interested in working with journalists, on any kind of question they want to email us or just talk about, a topic. So,
is there any particular, so you've got this data, is there any way that you can help them parse it to find specific stories, or?
Yeah, I think that's where, they can browse through the reports that we're doing, and many of those are very timely. For example, we had a bunch of material that we created last winter on the Ukraine crisis, and what was being instantly proposed both in the US and in Europe to basically displace Russian natural gas. So we created basically a Europe mini tracker. So there's that kind of story. That's a big story that people want to hop onto, but also I just think that connecting directly to a specialist is one of the best ways. The other way would just be to look at what briefings and reports we've been releasing in the last few weeks. So we've got one on the North Sea, oil and gas, a lot of switching going on from companies that are leaving coal but then are just building gas. Stuff about China's steel industry. So there's just, as there's hundreds of stories around the world, and one of the things that we do provide is we provide a newsletter on gas and a newsletter on coal that comes out each week. So it's a global news digest, and people can subscribe to those for free. So this is the one on coal, called Coal Wire. We're now, I think, at about 437 issues. It's coming out weekly for about the last 8 years. And this year we launched one on gas called Inside Gas. And those are, the nice thing about those is they're not only collections of what's going on around the world, but they have each of them has an editor who really knows the sector and explains it, the significance of what's going on. So the one who does Inside Gas is Greg Aitken. And his perspectives every week, I think, are almost as useful as just the news items themselves. So a lot of journalists actually subscribe to these, and you can sign up for them on the GEM website.
And we can dig down deeper. I keep distracting you, and I'm sorry. We can dig down deeper into these in a little bit. So why don't you go ahead with where you were?
Yeah.
Because I want to get to the registry too, so we can talk about that.
Right. So the Registry of Fossil Fuels is a terrific project that is long overdue. And the basic idea is that the world is not going to get to our climate goals, our net zero, by mid-century, our 1.5 degree threshold. None of that is going to happen unless there's some coordinated activity to actually figure out what carbon is in the ground, and then come up with a strategy among countries to wind down. And so there is really no framework right now in the Paris process, in the global climate process, that focuses on the supply side like that. There isn't even the word coal, oil and gas. Those don't even appear in the Paris Accords. So this has been an initiative by a lot of civil society groups around the idea of focusing attention on the supply side of oil and gas, and starting with the idea of, do we even know where the carbon in the ground is? Do we know, and obviously there's some obstacles here. For example, OPEC, it's a state secret what's in the ground in Saudi Arabia. But the only way we can sort of deal with the problem is to start with the knowledge that we have, highlight the areas where there are information gaps, and just apply whatever leverage we can to get that knowledge out there. So we've been basically doing an inventory of carbon in the ground, most importantly coal, oil, and gas, and then showing where it all is, mapping it all, and then creating some good front end tools so that people in civil society and governments in local areas can all start to talk about the problem with adequate information. Our part of that as Global Energy Monitor has been the underlying data. So we have two projects. One is our Global Coal Mine Tracker. Where are all the coal mines around the world? Who owns each one? How big is it? Et cetera. The other one is the Global Oil and Gas Extraction Tracker. So where are all the oil and gas fields around the world? Again, who owns it? How big are the resources? How much are they pumping right now? And what are the prospective resources?
So the registry layers on top of that.
That's right.
What sort of resources remain in the ground?
That's right. And we used, for our underlying data, we used the same techniques that I showed earlier in the coal tracker. We show where each coal mine or oil and gas field is located. And then we allow for, the ways that people can do a deep dive in to find out the details.
And this is the registry you're looking at now?
No, right now I'm looking at our underlying data.
Okay. Yep.
What that registry does, and I'm going to switch over to that here. What the registry does is provide an analytical layer on top of that converts carbon in the ground into greenhouse gas impacts. So how much, say, because you have various things that come out of the ground. You have carbon dioxide, but you may also have methane. And I think most climate journalists are aware that methane is many, many times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so both of those things have to be, the apples and the oranges have to be brought together and talked about in some unified way. This is the kind of thing that the Global Registry aims to do. It aims to be able to give you the sort of translate it all into a way that policymakers and the media can talk about this question of carbon in the ground. So it looks at countries, it looks at individual, it lets you zoom in on individual oil and gas fields and see what their trajectory is and whether it aligns with climate goals, et cetera. So it's an ambitious project, but one of the great things about it is it's really getting a lot of traction out there in civil society. The Vatican a couple of weeks ago endorsed it, and so there's governments all around the world, who are sort of and obviously civil society groups, NGOs, who are all uniting in this call for a managed approach to phasing out fossil fuels, and as an intermediate step, even knowing where they are and have really good visibility into them.
And you've partnered with another group. Can you just briefly discuss what their role has been in pulling the registry together?
That's right. So the other group is Carbon Tracker Initiative, and Carbon Tracker is located in Britain. They were started by people from the financial sector who were really noticing, I guess I would say, that there was a lot of assumptions built into the valuations of energy companies, assumptions that that the party will never stop, basically. So the value of Chevron is based on this idea that the kind of levels of extraction that are going on now won't go down. They are saying there's this large, they call it the carbon bubble, this idea that literally trillions of dollars of financial assets are resting on the bet that human society will not solve the climate problem. Because if we do, those companies will not pump all that out. They will not have those kind of profits. And maybe, just maybe, that's not the right bet. So that was the basic question, I guess I'd say, that that the Carbon Tracker Initiative originally was organized to address. And they did a seminal study about a decade ago looking into, okay, what if we did take this seriously? How much money do these large financial firms, are they exposed to in terms of their risk? And maybe that actually ought to be part of the official inventory of things that we all sort of ask about on a regular basis about big companies. What is your exposure? And do they have a responsibility to talk about it? Anyway, that's all been a huge contribution that Carbon Tracker has made. So similar to us, they do a lot of data, and they do a lot of analysis, and their I'd say their focus is more on the financial sector. But this is a project that they where they brought their expertise on basically greenhouse gas impact analysis to bear on this data set that we had created. And so we've combined together to do that.
And we were going to have Rob from their North American office join us, but had a last-minute conflict, so he couldn't jump on the call. So I'm sorry he couldn't be a part of this. But that's another source if you're looking particularly at this financial element, that Carbon Tracker is a good place to look to as well. So can you tell us, is there more to tell us about this? Because I've got a good question from my friend Osha Davidson that I want to bring up. That's something we discussed earlier this week, but I want to make sure that we're clear on how this functions.
I wish Rob were here to demo it, to really sort of walk you through the bells and whistles with the platform and what it can do. I haven't demoed it before, but I can say that one of the things that it can do is it lets you drill down into a particular country, and then it lets you match up that country's trajectory up against what are sort of the parameters, the constraints of actually that the IPCC and the IEA have identified around, like, how much can we really take out of the ground. So it'll show visually the discrepancy between what's happening and what should happen. So it's got great data visualization capacities, but I don't want to try to start demoing it and then do a lousy job.
Right. Well, maybe we'll try and get them on at some other point to do this specifically. But a journalist should be aware of the registry and the additional layers that it offers to the data that you already have in place, especially business. I would say business financial reporters. This would be a very important tool for them as they look at this. So it can break down by company as well as a country level.
Yeah, and this is really an issue around the financial community, not just for oil and gas upstream, the extraction, but all kinds of stuff. Like right now, there's a lot of controversy over things like big pipelines, big LNG terminals, and there's a lot of talk about the insecurity that these things create. So, for example, there was Russia or somebody. I shouldn't say Russia, nobody knows. Somebody blew up the pipeline from Russia to Germany deliberately. There's a similar long pipeline from Russia to China. That shut down. Wasn't so much in the news. It was a scheduled maintenance week where it was shut down, but it raised a terrific amount of speculation in the Chinese media. Like, are they playing games with us? So right now, these very large infrastructure projects are creating insecurity all around the world. So it's a story with ramifications. Once you have these, I call it long gas or distant gas, where we here in one country are extremely vulnerable to events far away. Everybody heard about the big ship that was caught in the Suez Canal. When that happened, it affected gas markets in Asia. So one of the really odd things about the investment world is that when people talk about infrastructure, they think about bridges and roads and these things that are sort of long-term, very stable, kind of boring investments that are super safe. Right now in the energy sector, infrastructure is like probably the least safe, place. If your goal is to stay out of the news and just quietly make money, I think pipelines are probably not looking so good right now, and that's a really interesting thing that's going on in the economic world. And the way people used to talk about renewables was like, oh, the wind might blow, the sun might shine. This is very sketchy. Now renewables are being understood in this whole different way as a far more energy secure source, as long as they're integrated into a system, with demand management and energy storage. Batteries are getting cheaper, and suddenly the narrative is shifting in this very subtle but important way away from, okay, fossil fuels may be dirty, but let's all realize they're much more practical and secure. Let's not the future on renewables. Suddenly it's sort of flipping.
And this is a good way to move this over to how journalists can interact with this data and find stories. Is my resilience program for the last few years has been focused on resilience science, which is basically how an ecosystem can respond to a disturbance and how well they can do that. So you can look at ecosystems from a regional or a global perspective, as we're talking about with these long supply chains for energy, or in a more smaller regional or local sense. So when you're looking at it from a global perspective, the energy infrastructure is rather brittle in many areas, as you're describing. So one way, and it's hard to translate that story to your local community. But if you think of energy as a shed, similar to a watershed, where does your local energy come from? Where does that, what does that shed encompass for that energy? Whether you can look at it from a coal and natural gas perspective, you can look at it from a renewable perspective, but this is one way that journalists can start thinking about energy in a different way. Instead of saying, wow, we've got this massive energy grid in the U.S., so I don't even know where energy comes from. We're probably getting it at night from hydro in Oregon or Washington. I mean, where do we get our power? But if you start thinking more in a systems way and a shed way, an energy shed, it sort of changes the way you view the stories that you want to look at, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really powerful insight, and I think that because it combines sort of an integrated view of energy alongside the other natural systems that we all are very familiar with intuitively, whether it's watershed, it's looking at it through that same way. What are these systems that sort of support our life? And energy is one of them.
Oh, we've seen the same problem with food. The valley out in California, a lot of our spinach comes from there. But with the drought underway, that's creating problems. And how will that affect our food shed and where our food comes from? So we can talk about that more. I want to get to OSHA's question real quick. This is something we talked about earlier this week. But this is about how you can research siting of facilities, but also environmental justice. And that's an area I don't want to miss. So for those who are not familiar with that term, and I doubt there are many from SEJ who don't know it, but environmental justice is related to the siting of plants, and they're often in poor neighborhoods. They're in neighborhoods with people of color, and they're the ones that bear the brunt of the pollution from these facilities. So is there any way with any of the trackers that we've been talking about that journalists can use to look at siting issues and environmental justice issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say two things about that is we start tracking what we create a page on any project once it's actually in the very early proposal stage. So it often needs to be understood very early in a community before it kind of locks in. And
so you're starting a page when it's proposed, not once it's already in place.
We have a bunch of stages before construction, and the earliest is called announced. That's when it shows up on some long range plan. And so this is like headlights for the movement. So that
how do you find those? Are these groups alerting you to it, or do you have some system in place to get alerts when this happens?
Well, the industry talks about these plants really early on, and they're in long range. They're in integrated resource plans. They're in, utilities have to talk in terms of like 15-year planning horizons, and some countries even plan out like 20 or 30 years. So you will start to see them even when they don't have a name, but you'll see how big they are and where they want to put it. And gradually it starts to form. It's like a picture that is first a little bit blurry, but then you get more and more specifics. As soon as we actually have a location and a company and an owner, even when we don't have a name, we will create a page for it. Generally, they'll get a name. Some of these projects will take well over a decade. So we're starting to track them very early. And the good thing is people don't need to know who Global Energy Monitor is, and we don't really care. And we're not a very well-known group, because people they see those names show up in the news, they'll put it into Google, and then Google will find our fact sheet. So if you can try this out yourselves on any energy plant that you know about, type it into Google, you'll probably find a Global Energy Monitor page on it if it's over 30 megawatts, which is a pretty small plant. When these pages are created, one of the things we also create is we create a profile of what is the citizen action around it. And often that includes what is the socioeconomic profile of that area? Well, what's the racial profile? What's the income profile? So that's all stuff that is available, in demographic databases.
And you guys bring that together. You find that
in particular parts of the country, people know about Cancer Alley and the Gulf, where it's not just the individual project that has impacts, but the collective impact of so many, like crowding in a certain area, that has to be understood. And so, part of what journalists are doing, if they're doing a good job, is they're not just talking about projects in isolation.
Okay, so this data is available on your site. So that goes directly to the question. I guess this doesn't make sense. I was just trying to think if there's some way of doing alerts in regions for when so in other words, so a journalist or anybody doesn't have to keep coming back and checking to see if something new is up there. But I guess that's the process, which is, I guess, a small price to pay if you're a journalist covering this, to just have, an alert on your calendar show up every 3 months, check the tracker to see if a new site's been introduced.
Well, I would say there's various ways. That's one good way, is if you put some kind of a notifier in Google. Another way is to be connected. Every region has a network of environmental groups, they're working on a topic, particular really high impact areas like the Permian Basin. There's a whole collection of environmental groups working in the Permian Basin. That's the really big new oil area in Texas, New Mexico. It's actually going to be surpassing Saudi Arabia in barrels per day. It's so big. It's vaulted the U.S. into the leading, to be the leading oil producer, et cetera. Anyway, there's whole coalitions of groups just working on the Permian. So one way is to connect to those groups. Another way is, to subscribe to the newsletter we do on oil and gas, where or coal, where we're constantly flagging things that come out. We're sort of watching the industry press and then basically pulling all that stuff together. It's hard. And I would say I've seen many communities that wake up to a project when it's already too late, or when it's much harder, I'd say, to leverage. So the earlier communities know about projects, obviously, the more leverage they have.
And when I talked about journalists coming to your site every few months to check, and of course, it occurred to me after I said that I would suspect that most SEJ members who are covering energy issues already know about the utility companies and the regulators and where to go to see when these things begin. But this is sort of a fallback for them, I guess, that they can come here and see.
One thing I would flag is that it's really a shame that there's fewer working journalists on the beat because there's more misinformation, including deliberate misinformation. So just for example, people read about what happened in Texas around bad weather and the grid went down, et cetera. There were some, bloggers who were putting up basically phony information about problems with wind turbines. And then that was amplified by Fox, and it was amplified by the governor. And it wasn't an accident that's happened. It was a coordinated campaign. It's been documented by the Global Wind Energy Association, and they used it as a case study and how this is becoming this is becoming contested terrain, particularly renewables, that when there's vested interest that want to sort of suppress renewables. Because right now, solar and wind are now cheaper than both gas and coal. And the only thing really holding them back is that the industry is so entrenched.
But it's fascinating to me that as that story unfolded, because Texas has been very proud of their wind and solar and, their ability to bypass a lot of delays in getting transmission lines put in. So they're able to really get this stuff online. And yet when it came down to it, they were quick to throw it under the bus when it wasn't even their problem.
That's a really good point. I mean, they've actually had, wind has done so well in Texas that coal plants that were brand new were shut down after only operating for 7 years. They're already uneconomical. So.
And they've got coal plants have a long lifetime, so 7 years is short for that. Well, so we've talked about your fact sheets. We've talked about access to your researchers for journalists and how they can reach out and ask questions there. Do you have any other tips from the data that you have on hand that would help journalists? The reason I wanted to do this is that it's often difficult for journalists working locally to see these broader databases, these larger sets, and really get their head around how do I bring that to my local community. So do you have any other thoughts on how they could do that with the information that you and the registry both provide?
Well, I mean, this is not some deep insight, but I think one thing that everybody's noticing is how pretty much every story, like it's hard to build it's hard to talk about agriculture without talking about weather and climate, and then that gets you to talking about energy, and it's sort of amazing how many areas of expertise you have to have as a journalist, not just covering energy, but covering any of those things. So, I mean, I live in California, and obviously our drought doesn't just affect our fires, but it also affects how much hydroelectricity the state creates, which affects and so the way things are connected around energy. I really liked your example of, thinking of energy in terms of an energy shed, like a watershed. And I think that helps bring it down to earth a bit. And I do think that there is going to be an increase, instability seems to be, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like instability is becoming itself an issue around, just like things that are happening so far away seem to impact our lives. And we're living in sort of a politically very divided time, and everything becomes politicized. So anyway, in that kind of world, I think that just the general public is looking for security. And I mean, my personal mission in this work is to support the climate movement, because I think the climate movement isn't just about climate; it's about really making a livable world. And it's not just about the temperature outside, it's also about the security of our economic lives. So anyway, I think that trying to find a way to tell the stories about how things are connected, but also some of the path forward that has basically a vision of how society can work, that we don't have to stay on this, what seems like a self-destructive path for society, that there's a new energy economy emerging, and that it has all kinds of side benefits. So another thing people talk about, they talk about externalities when they talk about energy. We're all used to saying, oh, the problem with fossil fuels is that all these pollution impacts and health impacts and climate impacts aren't built into the price. Well, similarly with renewables, there's positive externalities. There's all kinds of benefits that we don't necessarily think about or see built into the price. And one of those is
health is one, yeah,
health, security, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the people who are out there on the front lines explaining all this to the public, it's an immensely difficult task. People do just take energy for granted. Very few people who live in a city have even thought about a coal plant. They've never been to a coal mine, et cetera, et cetera. So
I've talked about this a lot in this program, and it's something I keep hammering because it's really important to me. Is the people in general. This isn't a reflection on journalists. People in general, we tend to narrow our worldview. We manage what's in front of us. I wake up often in the morning feeling like I'm walking on a loose pile of sand and just a little bit unstable with everything that's happening in the world right now. And so we tend to focus on what's in front of us and the threats that and the good things, but the threats that we can address immediately. So we tend to be narrow in scope, and that means looking at one issue at a time. Our brains, I guess, aren't necessarily wired to deal with complexity, but the world is complex. So what you're describing is what they call compound risk. And this is something, there's a professor at Columbia named Radley Horton and a few others that do a lot of work in this and a lot of important work. And during COVID in Florida is one of the best examples that I like to give is a hurricane was coming. Well, then people go to shelters, but COVID was going on. So you've got this additional risk. So suddenly you can't utilize the shelters as you were before because you had to maintain physical distancing. So that created problems in that regard. Same thing fires out west. So you have a drought, which reduces available water to dump on the wildfires. It increases temperatures, which makes wildfires perhaps more likely and more dangerous. So we need to begin thinking in complex ways, but find simple ways to present them to people. And this is the to me the biggest challenge that journalists face right now is the ability to convey the complex nature of these issues in a way that's accessible.
Yeah, and I guess one more thing I would say about the challenge is people think the future will sort of unfold in some linear fashion, like we're going to steadily get more renewables or whatever. It's not like that when it comes to these economic transformations. So one of the things that's happening is that solar, wind, and battery storage are all plummeting in price so fast that even the energy planners who do this all the time have continually surprised by how fast the pace is going. And as you get down to these really dirt cheap prices for solar panels and battery storage, it is literally going to be wiping entire fossil sector off the map. So it's only a question of how fast. From a climate perspective, it has to happen darn fast. But it's similar to what happened with computers. Nobody expected how cheap computers would become. It used to be very expensive to have just a small amount of computing power, and then suddenly this exponential pace of change, just sort of really, really changed the world economy. That's what's coming in energy, and people are not. It's very hard to communicate, and it's even harder to sort of just change expectations around it.
So you think we've crossed a tipping point that has made this forward rush much more advanced?
Yeah, and it's also an optimistic story, which it's really hard to tell optimistic stories. Somehow they don't play as well as sort of terrible stories. But it gives me a lot of optimism, and I can see how countries. We actually happen to live in a country with a really strong fossil fuel. Well, no surprise, political sector, because we're the world's leading oil producer. So you actually see the transformation happening a lot faster in places that aren't big. Say China right now, they're doubling the amount of wind and solar that they put in versus last year. At the pace at which they're implementing wind and solar is just astonishing. So anyway, the United States in a certain way is one of the most resistant societies to the energy transformation.
But that's interesting context that journalists should be looking at when they're writing these stories. And I would push back a little bit that hopeful stories don't get as much play because they do. It's a question of how they're written and the context used to show that. And surveys continue to show that people need that and they want that. And that's an important aspect of their interest in media is they want to have some level of hope in their stories. So, and a lot of SCJ members, a lot of environmental journalists understand this and do this in their stories because it's significant. And the best way, of course, to write a story is as a story, not as data. So that means involving people and telling these stories through their eyes. And that's where you often find a lot of that hope. So especially in this world where we feel like we're walking on that sand pile. It's good to have some hope to give us a little bit of stability in our lives. So that's important too. Look, we've gone our hour. Do you have any other last things you want to talk, or anything, any other points you want to make? There's a lot more we can do here, but what I want journalists watching to take away from this is the depth of data that you have available and the ease of use in the way that you've presented it, and the access to experts who can help walk them through it and answer questions they might have. Does that sort of sum it up?
Yeah, it's been such a treat to be able to talk about this stuff with you, and I really invite all the people watching this to come and take advantage and contact our staff if they've got anything they want to explore, or kick around with them in terms of stories, etc.
Fantastic. So stay with me after we end here, Ted, if you would. But I want to thank you for being with us on this program. Next week, Andy Revkin will have something new. And if you want to rewatch this program or any other program in our series, be sure and check out Andy's YouTube page. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye now.